In the remote scrubland near El Dorado, Texas, there is a place that looks, at first glance, like a religious campus. A gleaming white temple with a spire visible for miles. Neat rows of houses. Children playing. Women in floor-length pastel dresses with their hair piled high in the style of 19th-century prairie settlers. It is called the Yearning for Zion Ranch. The people who live there call themselves members of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They call their leader the Prophet. On April 3, 2008, Texas authorities received a phone call from inside the compound. A young woman said she was 16 years old and had been forced into marriage and abused by a 50-year-old man who invoked God's name every time he touched her. The call turned out to be a hoax, made by a woman in Colorado who had no connection to the compound. But the raid it triggered was real. And what Texas investigators found when they entered the YFZ ranch was not a hoax. Nearly 400 children were removed from the compound. Dozens of underage girls were pregnant or had already given birth. Records seized from the property documented something that its leader, Warren Jeffs, had apparently seen no reason to hide. He had written it all down. This is the story of Warren Jeffs, the man who told a community of 10,000 people that God had sent him children as brides, and the recordings, documents, and courtroom that ultimately put him in a Texas prison for the rest of his natural life. To understand Warren Jeffs, you must first understand the world that created him. The Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is not the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. These are two entirely separate organizations with fundamentally different beliefs. The mainstream LDS Church, the church with millions of members globally, renounced the practice of polygamy in 1890 and has no affiliation with or tolerance for the FLDS. This distinction matters, because the FLDS has spent decades hiding behind confusion between the two. The FLDS formed in the early 20th century when a group of fundamentalist Mormons refused to accept the mainstream church's renunciation of plural marriage. They believed polygamy was essential to salvation, that a faithful man must have at least 3 wives to enter the highest level of heaven, and that the more wives a man had, the closer to God he stood. They established a community in the twin towns of Colorado City, Arizona, and Hilldale, Utah, a place locals call Short Creek, and lived in increasing isolation from mainstream American society, operating their own schools, their own businesses, their own systems of governance. By the late 20th century, the FLDS had perhaps 10,000 members spread across Short Creek, smaller settlements in Canada and Mexico, and a newer compound in West Texas that would become the center of the case against their prophet. Warren Steed Jeffs was born into this world on December 3, 1955. He never left it. Warren was the son of Rulon Jeffs, who became the FLDS prophet in 1986 after a series of internal power struggles. Rulon consolidated authority in himself alone, eliminating the church's governing council and positioning the prophet as the singular voice of God on earth. Whatever the prophet said was divine law. Whatever the prophet commanded was God's will. Warren grew up understanding that his father held absolute power over the lives of thousands of people. He watched how that power worked. He learned it from the inside. He served as the principal of Alta Academy, the FLDS private school near Salt Lake City, where he taught children the doctrine of the church, obedience to the prophet, the righteousness of plural marriage, the sinfulness of the outside world. Former students later described a man who was calculating, controlling, and consumed by his own authority even then. In the late 1990s, as Rulon's health declined, Warren began assuming day-to-day control of the community. When Rulon died in 2002, Warren declared himself the new prophet, God's mouthpiece on earth, the sole interpreter of divine will for the FLDS. One of his first acts as prophet was to marry some of his own father's widows. He then began building the YFZ ranch in El Dorado, Texas, a compound far from the scrutiny that law enforcement in Utah and Arizona had begun to apply to Short Creek. He wanted distance and walls and watchtowers, and he built them. As prophet, Warren Jeffs did not merely lead a church. He controlled every aspect of his followers' lives with a specificity that left no room for individual choice. He decided what members could wear, the women and girls in floor-length dresses in pastels, with their hair braided and piled in a style deliberately chosen to echo an earlier, supposedly purer era. He decided what they could consume, no television, no internet, no music he hadn't approved. He decided which books were acceptable and which constituted worldly contamination. He expelled members for disobedience. In January 2004, he banished 20 men from the Short Creek community in a single day, removing the mayor among them, and reassigned their wives and children to other men. Families built over years were dissolved and redistributed on the prophet's instruction. And he controlled marriage. In the FLDS, the prophet held sole authority over who married whom. Men did not choose their wives. Women did not choose their husbands. The prophet assigned. The prophet reassigned. The prophet could take a man's wife and give her to someone else if he decided the first man was insufficiently devoted. And the prophet, it emerged, also assigned girls. Evidence gathered from FLDS records showed that Warren Jeffs had himself taken 78 wives. 24 of them were under the age of 18 at the time of their marriage. 12 had been 12 or 13 years old when he married them. He documented this. His own priesthood records detailed the assignments. His own words, written with the flourish of divine authority, described God sending him young girls, described their purpose in his household, described what he expected of them. He wrote, "If the world knew what I was doing, they would hang me from the highest tree." The first serious legal challenge to Warren Jeffs came not from a raid or an investigation, but from a young woman who found the courage to leave. Alyssa Wall had grown up in the FLDS. In 2001, when she was 14 years old, Warren Jeffs arranged her marriage to her 19-year-old cousin, Alan Steed. She told Jeffs she did not want to marry. She was told that her feelings were irrelevant, that the prophet's assignment came from God, and her duty was obedience. The marriage was deeply unhappy. Alyssa later described abuse she suffered and went to Jeffs multiple times asking to be released from the marriage. Each time, she was told to submit, to be obedient, to pray for acceptance of God's will. She eventually escaped the community and went to law enforcement. Her testimony would become the spine of the first criminal case against Jeffs. In May 2006, the FBI added Warren Jeffs to its 10 most wanted list, offering a $100,000 reward. Jeffs, who had gone into hiding, was traveling with multiple cell phones, wigs, sunglasses, and more than $50,000 in cash when he was pulled over during a routine traffic stop north of Las Vegas in August 2006. He was arrested without incident. In 2007, Jeffs was convicted in Utah of 2 counts of rape as an accomplice for arranging Alyssa's marriage. He was sentenced to 10 years to life. In 2010, the Utah Supreme Court overturned the conviction due to flawed jury instructions, a ruling that infuriated Alyssa Wall and law enforcement across the country. But by then, something else had happened. In April 2008, Texas had raided the YFZ ranch. And what they found there would build a far stronger case than the Utah prosecution had ever had. On April 3, 2008, a woman called a domestic abuse hotline claiming to be a 16-year-old inside the YFZ ranch who was being abused by her 50-year-old husband. Texas authorities obtained a search warrant and entered the compound. The hoax caller was later identified as a woman in Colorado with a history of making false reports. But the warrant was valid when served, and the evidence found inside the compound was real. Investigators entered a world that seemed to have been operating entirely outside the reach of law or accountability. The White Temple, still under construction at the time of the raid, was searched and found to contain a bed inside what investigators described as a ceremonial room, along with evidence consistent with Jeffs having used the space for spiritual marriages with underage girls. Records were seized from the main building. Documents detailing marriages, ages, assignments, photographs, audio recordings, and children. Everywhere, children. The Texas Department of Family and Protective Services removed 437 children from the compound. Girls in their early teens who were pregnant. Girls who had already given birth. Girls whose ages, at first glance, were impossible to establish because they had been raised to appear younger than they were and to say nothing to outsiders. The initial removal order was later challenged in court, and the majority of the children were returned to their families after courts ruled the state had not met the legal standard for wholesale removal. But the criminal investigation that the raid had generated continued, and the evidence seized from the compound was devastating. The evidence recovered from the YFZ ranch included something Warren Jeffs had apparently not believed anyone would ever use against him, his own detailed records of what he had done. Jeffs had a practice of recording himself. He recorded sermons. He recorded instructions to followers. He recorded ceremonies. And investigators found recordings that, when played in a Texas courtroom, produced visible reactions from jurors and observers that went beyond what words can easily describe. One recording captured a man's voice, identified as Jeffs, speaking to young wives about what he described as their mission. The voice said, "You have to know how to be sexually excited and to help each other. You have to be ready for the time I need your comfort. Take your clothes off. Do it right now." The sounds on the recording that followed left no ambiguity about what had been documented. Another recording captured Jeffs apparently conducting a ceremony in the temple's baptismal font with underage girls. His own written records, entered into evidence, included passages in which he wrote about God sending him increasingly young brides. One entry read, "Things are happening so quickly. There is an even younger girl that the Lord wants me to take. She is 13. For some reason, the Lord is sending me these girls that can be worked with." The same records documented that he had arranged more than 550 bigamous marriages within the FLDS community, 67 of them to underage girls. Warren Jeffs went on trial in San Angelo, Texas, in August 2011, charged with the sexual assault of two of his spiritual wives, a 15-year-old girl and a 12-year-old girl who had later given birth to his child. The trial of Warren Jeffs was, by any measure, strange. He fired his attorneys and represented himself. He called no meaningful witnesses. He presented no coherent defense to the charges against him. Instead, he treated the proceedings as an act of religious persecution, protesting repeatedly that the court had no authority over prophet of God, that the charges represented an attack on his people's faith, that he was being tried for his beliefs rather than his actions. He used his allocated speaking time not to address the evidence against him, but to read scripture and dictate letters to the President of the United States demanding the case be dismissed on religious freedom grounds. When prosecutors played the recordings in court, the voice giving instructions to young wives, the sounds that followed, Jeff sat silently. He did not explain them. He did not challenge them. He did not offer an alternative interpretation. He sat with his hands folded and said nothing. When the jury delivered its verdict on August 4, 2011, finding him guilty on both counts, Jeffs made no outward response. At sentencing, he had 30 minutes to address the court. He used the time to sit in silence. The only words he spoke were three: "I am at peace." The jury deliberated for 30 minutes. They sentenced Warren Jeffs to life in prison for the aggravated sexual assault of the 12-year-old girl and 20 years for the assault of the 15-year-old girl. The sentences were to run consecutively. Under Texas law, Jeffs must serve at least 35 years of the life sentence and 10 years of the 20-year sentence before being eligible for parole. He was 55 years old when sentenced. He will not be eligible for parole until he is over 100 years old. His only comment as officers led him from the courtroom, "I am at peace." Warren Jeffs is currently incarcerated at the Louis C. Powledge Unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice near Palestine, Texas. He is 70 years old. Imprisonment has not ended his influence over the FLDS, or his attempts to exercise it. From his prison cell, Jeffs has reportedly continued to issue instructions to the community through phone calls, coded letters, and followers who visited him. Prison officials have suspected that some followers used recording devices disguised as everyday items to capture weekly meetings with him. In 2022, he was linked to a written edict issued from inside the prison walls. Some FLDS members still regard Jeffs as the true prophet, believing, as the community's theology requires them to believe, that a prophet of God cannot be wrong, and that Jeffs' imprisonment is a form of martyrdom he is enduring for their sins. Jeffs' nephew, Brent Jeffs, who testified during the sentencing phase that his uncle had abused him when he was 5 years old, said after the verdict, "Justice has been served." Jeffs' own sister, Elaine, who had left the FLDS in 1984, watched her brother sentenced from inside the courtroom. "He's a pervert," she said. "And the crazy thing is, he perverted his own religion." Elissa Wall, whose testimony launched the first criminal proceedings against Jeffs, wrote a memoir about her experiences titled Stolen Innocence. She has spoken publicly for years about the need to protect children from closed religious communities that treat abuse as a divine command. The FLDS compound in Short Creek has fractured since Jeffs' imprisonment. An offshoot led by a man named Samuel Bateman, who styled himself a prophet in Jeffs' tradition and was himself convicted of child abuse and sentenced to federal prison in 2023, demonstrated that the systemic abuse Jeffs represented did not end with his incarceration. The children on the YFZ ranch in 2008 had grown up in a world where a man's word was God's word, where what happened to them was framed as divine purpose, where the language used to describe their abuse was the language of sanctity and blessing and celestial assignment. Many of them had been taught that the moment they stepped outside the compound, they were in spiritual danger, that the world beyond the fence was corrupt and faithless and would destroy them, that obedience to the prophet was the only path to salvation. Warren Jeffs built that world deliberately, because it served him. He used the vocabulary of faith to construct an architecture of control. He used the authority of God to insulate himself from accountability. And he wrote it all down, because he believed, until a Texas jury proved him wrong, that no one who mattered would ever read it. The recordings played in that San Angelo courtroom, his own voice, preserved on his own devices, describing what he was doing to children, were the instrument of his undoing. He had called himself God's prophet on earth. The jury deliberated for 30 minutes. Warren Jeffs will die in prison. The question for the FLDS members and survivors who remain is how to rebuild lives and an understanding of faith and community that does not rest on the word of one man who told them that God wanted their daughters. Subscribe to Quick Crime Vault. Every case in this vault deserves to be told completely, especially the ones that expose what power looks like when no one is watching. We'll see you in the next vault.